The clerk's hands are shaking as he copies the figures into the ledger. It is late afternoon in Constantinople, autumn 1854, and the light through the window is failing. He dips his pen again and writes the number, £3 million sterling. Beside it, in a second column, he records the interest rate. Then, the collateral. His superior stands behind him, silent, watching each stroke of the pen. When the clerk reaches the section marked Egyptian tribute payments, he pauses. His superior nods. The clerk writes the words that will redirect the wealth of an entire province, the richest in the empire, to banks in London. He does not fully understand what he is writing. He knows only that the Sultan has agreed to these terms, that Russian armies are gathering on the Danube, and that without this money, there will be no modern rifles, no cannons, no war. He finishes the entry and blots the page. The ink is still wet when his superior takes the book and leaves the room. Outside, in the streets of the capital, people are celebrating. Britain and France have agreed to help. The empire will be saved. But in this quiet office, something else has just happened. The Ottoman Empire has taken its first foreign loan. For 6 centuries, it has borrowed from no one. That principle is now broken. The date is August 1854. The place is the Sublime Porte, administrative heart of the Ottoman Empire. The event is a signature, a handshake, a promise to repay. It is the beginning of the something the empire will not be able to undo. Before we dive deep, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. What is at risk is not obvious at first. The soldiers being mobilized to fight Russia believe they are defending their homeland. The Sultan believes he is securing an alliance. The British public, buying Ottoman bonds in London, believes they are supporting a just cause, the defense of a weaker nation against aggression. But what is actually at stake is sovereignty itself. The ability of a state to govern its own revenue, to tax its own people and spend that money as it sees fit. The moment the Sultan signs that contract, this ability begins to slip away. The scope is vast. The Ottoman Empire still controls territories from the Balkans to Baghdad, from the Aegean to the Arabian Peninsula. Millions of people live under its rule. They grow wheat, herd sheep, pay taxes, serve in armies. Their labor sustains the state. But now, a portion of that labor, a portion that will grow with each passing year, will flow not to Constantinople, but to London. The arrangement is presented as temporary, a loan to fight a war. Once the war is won, the debt will be managed. But the terms are structured in a way that makes repayment nearly impossible. The interest is high. The collateral is the empire's most reliable income stream. And there is no provision for what happens if the Ottomans cannot pay. The trap is not visible yet. It will take 20 years to close. We are looking at a moment when finance becomes a weapon of empire, more effective and more enduring than military conquest. The Crimean War is taught as a clash of armies, a struggle over the balance of power in Europe. That is true. But it is also the moment when European banks discovered they could use debt to control nations that were too large or too distant to occupy. This is not a story about heroes or villains in the traditional sense. It is a story about incentives, about the logic of capital, about what happens when a state that has never borrowed is suddenly introduced to the international bond market. It is a story told in ledgers, not in battle reports. And it begins not with a declaration of war, but with a handshake in a banker's office in the City of London. The conditions that led to this moment were built over decades. By the 1880s, the Ottoman Empire was still vast, but its internal systems were failing. Tax collection was inefficient and corrupt. Provincial governors skimmed revenue before it reached the capital. The army was large but outdated, still relying on tactics and equipment that had not changed significantly since the 18th century. Meanwhile, the European powers Britain, France, Russia, Austria had industrialized. They had railways, telegraphs, steam-powered navies, rifled artillery. The gap in military capability was widening every year. The Ottoman leadership understood this. Reformers within the government pushed for modernization. They wanted to build railways, establish modern schools, reorganize the army along European lines. But all of this required capital, and the empire's treasury was chronically empty. The Sultan lived in immense luxury, and the court consumed vast sums, but there was little left over for infrastructure or defense. At the same time, the empire's position in Europe was becoming precarious. Nationalist movements were stirring in the Balkans. Russia, which saw itself as the protector of Orthodox Christians under Ottoman rule, was looking for an opportunity to expand south. In 1853, that opportunity arrived. A dispute over control of holy sites in Jerusalem escalated into a diplomatic crisis. Russia demanded concessions from the Ottomans. When those concessions were refused, Russian troops crossed into Ottoman-controlled territories along the Danube. The Ottomans declared war, but they knew they could not win alone. They turned to Britain and France for help. The British had their own reasons to intervene. They feared that if Russia captured Constantinople, it would gain control of the straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, threatening British trade routes to India. So Britain agreed to fight. But the British government and the British banks saw this as more than a military alliance. They saw it as a business opportunity. The forces shaping this crisis are not primarily military. They are financial and structural. The Ottoman economy was agrarian, dependent on taxing peasant farmers and controlling trade routes. It generated wealth slowly. The European economy, by contrast, was industrial and increasingly based on financial speculation. Banks in London and Paris had accumulated enormous capital. They needed places to invest it. Lending to foreign governments was seen as a safe and profitable business, especially if the loans were guaranteed by more powerful states. The British government encouraged this. Lending to the Ottomans served a strategic purpose. It tied the empire to British interests. If the Ottomans owed money to British banks, they would be less likely to align with Russia or France. Debt created dependency. But there was another force at work: the bond market itself. Once the first Ottoman loan was issued in London, it created a new asset class. Investors, widows, vicars, shopkeepers bought Ottoman bonds because they were told the bonds were safe, backed by the empire's vast lands and guaranteed by Britain's ally. The British press promoted these bonds as a patriotic investment. The demand was strong. This created pressure to issue more loans, regardless of whether the Ottomans could actually repay them. The banks made money on the commissions. The investors believed they were supporting a good cause, and the Ottomans, desperate for cash, kept signing. The system was designed to keep the money flowing in one direction, from Ottoman taxpayers to European creditors. The realization that something was wrong did not come all at once. In the immediate aftermath of the first loan, there was relief. The Ottomans used the money to buy weapons and supplies. The British and French armies landed in Crimea in September 1854. The war began in earnest. The fighting was brutal. Winter came early. Disease spread through the camps. Thousands of soldiers died not from combat but from cholera and exposure. But back in Constantinople, the mood was different. The Sultan's government was spending freely. New uniforms, new fortifications, payments to contractors and suppliers. Much of the money disappeared into the hands of officials who saw the war as an opportunity for personal enrichment. British advisors stationed in Constantinople watched this happen. They wrote reports back to London describing the waste and corruption. But the loans kept coming. In 1855, the Ottomans needed more money. The war was dragging on longer than expected. A second loan was arranged, this time for £5 million. The terms were harsher than the first. The interest rate was higher. The collateral now included not just Egyptian tribute, but also customs revenues from the ports of Smyrna and Syria. The British public bought these bonds too. The war finally ended in 1856. Russia was defeated. The Treaty of Paris was signed. The British celebrated. Newspapers declared that the sick man of Europe had been saved. But in the offices of the Ottoman treasury, officials were beginning to understand the arithmetic. The empire now owed £8 million to foreign creditors. The annual interest payments alone consumed a significant portion of the government's revenue, and there was no clear plan for how to repay the principal. The pressure did not ease after the war. It intensified. The Ottoman government tried to modernize. Sultan Abdülmecid wanted railways. He wanted telegraph lines. He wanted to reorganize the legal system and the military. Every project required money, and the only source of large-scale capital was the European bond market. So the borrowing continued. New loans in 1858, another in 1860, another in 1862. Each loan came with fees and commissions that reduced the actual cash received. A loan nominally worth £10 million might deliver only £7 million to the Ottoman treasury, with the rest going to bankers and intermediaries. But the Ottomans were obligated to repay the full £10 million, plus interest. The math was not sustainable. The empire's economy was not growing fast enough to service the debt. Revenue from taxes was stagnant. The cost of administering the vast territories was high. More and more of the budget was consumed by interest payments. Officials began borrowing new money just to pay the interest on old loans. This is the structure of a debt trap, and everyone involved understood it. The British government knew the Ottomans could not repay. The banks knew it, but the system kept functioning because each party had an incentive to keep it going. The banks made money on every transaction. The British government used the debt to maintain influence over Ottoman policy, and the Ottomans, desperate to avoid collapse, kept signing new contracts, hoping that somehow the situation would improve. The waiting was exhausting. Ottoman finance ministers came and went. Each one promised reform. Each one failed. The bureaucracy was too entrenched, the corruption too widespread, the European creditors too demanding. By the late 1860s, the Ottoman government faced a decision. They could attempt to restructure the debt, negotiate with the creditors for better terms, and accept the humiliation and political risk that would come with admitting they could not pay. Or they could keep borrowing, hope that something would change, an economic boom, a new discovery, a diplomatic breakthrough, and delay the reckoning. They chose to keep borrowing. In 1869, Sultan Abdulaziz authorized the construction of the Dolmabahce Palace, a vast complex on the shores of the Bosphorus. It was built with marble and crystal, gilded ceilings, massive chandeliers imported from Europe. It cost 35 tons of gold. The money came from loans. British bankers read the reports and shook their heads. They knew this was madness, but they also knew that as long as the Sultan kept borrowing, they would keep profiting. The decision to continue down this path was not irrational from the Sultan's perspective. Admitting insolvency would have triggered immediate consequences. European powers would demand concessions. There would be political upheaval in Constantinople. The empire might fracture. So the Sultan chose the illusion of solvency over the reality of collapse. It bought him time, but it made the eventual crash far worse. The people who bore the real cost of this system were not visible in the bond markets of London. They were the peasants in Anatolia who paid taxes on their harvests, the merchants in Aleppo who paid customs duties, the fishermen along the Black Sea coast who paid fees on their catch. They did not know that the money they handed to the tax collector was being sent to Europe. They did not understand why their roads were not being repaired, why their schools were not being built, why the army was still poorly equipped despite years of supposed reform. They knew only that life was hard, that the state demanded more each year, and that nothing seemed to improve. In the provincial towns, small acts of resistance occurred. Tax collectors were turned away. Farmers hid their grain. But these acts were individual and scattered. There was no organized opposition to the debt system because most people did not understand how it worked. The mechanisms of international finance were invisible to them. What they experienced was simply the slow erosion of their standard of living. And they adapted. Families grew smaller gardens. Women took on additional work. Communities helped each other survive. This quiet resilience kept the empire functioning, even as its financial structure rotted from within. By the early 1870s, the psychological strain on the Ottoman government was visible. Finance ministers worked in a state of constant crisis. Every year, they had to find new revenue to cover the interest payments. Every year, the creditors demanded more. The bureaucracy became obsessed with short-term survival. Long-term planning became impossible. The space for decision-making narrowed. Options that might have been available in 1855, renegotiating terms, defaulting early, seeking alternative allies, were no longer viable. The empire was locked into the system. European creditors had legal agreements. They had the backing of their governments. If the Ottomans tried to renege, they would face diplomatic isolation, possibly military intervention. At the same time, the empire's domestic problems were multiplying. Nationalist movements in the Balkans were gaining strength. The provinces were becoming harder to control. The military needed investment, but there was no money. The government was paralyzed. Officials in Constantinople developed a kind of fatalism. They knew the system could not continue. They knew collapse was coming, but they did not know when or what form it would take. So they continued processing paperwork, issuing bonds, paying interest, and hoping. In 1873, a global economic depression began. It started with a financial panic in Vienna and spread across Europe. Credit tightened. Investors became cautious. The market for risky bonds collapsed. At the same time, a severe drought struck Anatolia. Crop yields fell. Tax revenues dropped. The Ottoman government found itself in an impossible position. It needed to pay interest to its creditors, but it had no cash. It tried to issue new bonds, but no one would buy them. For the first time, the system stopped working. In the summer of 1875, Sultan Abdulaziz was deposed in a palace coup. His successor, Murad V, lasted only 3 months before being declared insane and replaced by Abdulhamid II. The new sultan looked at the books and realized there was no way forward. On the 6th of October 1875, the Ottoman government announced it would pay only half the interest due on its foreign debt. The other half would be paid in new bonds, essentially worthless paper. This was a partial default. The announcement sent shockwaves through the financial markets of Europe. The value of Ottoman bonds plummeted. Thousands of British investors lost their savings. Newspapers in London, which had once praised the brave Turks, now called the Ottoman government corrupt and incompetent. But this was not the sudden collapse it appeared to be. It was the culmination of 20 years of unsustainable borrowing. The illusion had finally broken. The default did not bring relief. It brought chaos. Russia, sensing weakness, declared war on the Ottomans in 1877. The empire fought desperately but lost territory in the Balkans and the Caucasus. Internally, the government was paralyzed. There was no money to rebuild, no money to pay the army, no money to administer the provinces. The European creditors, meanwhile, were furious. They had lost money, and they wanted it back. But instead of writing off the debt, they decided to take control. In 1881, after years of negotiation and pressure, the European powers forced the Ottoman government to sign the Decree of Muharrem. This document created a new institution, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, known as the OPDA. The OPDA was unlike anything that had existed before. It was a European-controlled organization with the legal authority to collect taxes directly from Ottoman subjects. It was run by a council of representatives from the creditor nations Britain, France, Germany, Austria, Italy. The Sultan had no vote, no veto. The OPDA was given control over the empire's most profitable revenue sources: the salt monopoly, the tobacco tax, the silk tithe, the stamp tax, the tax on spirits and fish. If you were a farmer in Anatolia and you bought a bag of salt, the money you paid did not go to your government. It went to the OPDA. It went to European bondholders. This was the final realization of the strategy that began in 1854. The British had not needed to occupy the Ottoman Empire with soldiers. They had occupied it with accountants. The consequences unfolded slowly. The OPDA was efficient. It collected taxes more effectively than the Ottoman government ever had. It employed thousands of officials. It built its own administrative infrastructure. It became, in effect, a parallel government. For the Ottoman state, this was a disaster. The revenue that used to fund schools, hospitals, roads, and the military now flowed to Europe. The empire had less money than ever to govern itself. When Sultan Abdul Hamid wanted to build a railway, he had to grant a concession to a European company because the government could not afford to build it. The British took control of railways in Iraq. The Germans took the route to Baghdad. The French took lines in Syria. The empire was being carved up by infrastructure. The psychological impact was profound. Ottoman officials understood that they were no longer governing a sovereign state. They were administrators of a territory controlled by foreign creditors. The humiliation was total, but there was no way out. The debt was legal. The OPDA had international backing. Any attempt to resist would be met with diplomatic pressure, financial sanctions, or military intervention. So, the system continued. Year after year, the OPDA collected taxes and sent the money to Europe. The Ottoman Empire functioned, but it did not belong to itself. The aftermath stretched across decades. The OPDA remained in place until the end of World War I. For an entire generation, the people of the Ottoman Empire lived under a system where their labor enriched foreign investors. The empire could not invest in its own development. It could not build the industries or infrastructure needed to compete with Europe. It fell further and further behind. When World War I began in 1914, the Ottoman government aligned with Germany. One of their goals was to abolish the OPDA and regain control of their economy. But it was too late. The empire was too weak. When the British Army marched into Jerusalem and Baghdad in 1917, they were not entering unknown territory. They were entering lands that their banks had effectively controlled for decades. The soldiers who died in the Crimean War believed they were fighting for a noble cause. They believed they were defending a weaker nation against aggression. But the war they fought created the mechanism for the financial colonization of the Middle East. The loans that were supposed to help the Ottomans survive became the chains that bound them. When the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed in 1918, its successor states, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, inherited portions of the debt. They began their existence burdened by obligations they had no part in creating. The legacy of the Crimean War debt persisted long after the empire was gone. The meaning of this story is not that the British were uniquely cruel or that the Ottomans were uniquely incompetent. The meaning is that debt, in the hands of a stronger power, can be a more effective tool of control than military conquest. The British Empire did not need to occupy every Ottoman province. It needed only to control the flow of money. This is a pattern that has repeated throughout history. Developing nations take loans from wealthier nations. The loans come with conditions. When the borrower cannot repay, the creditor gains influence over policy, resources, infrastructure. Sovereignty erodes, not through invasion, but through insolvency. The Crimean War is taught as a story about battles and alliances, but the real war was fought in bank offices and bond markets. It was a war over who would control the wealth generated by millions of people across the Middle East, and that war was won by the creditors. The Ottoman Empire was not saved in 1854. It was purchased. The story does not end with the empire's collapse. The Middle East that emerged from World War I was shaped by the debt crisis of the 19th century. The borders drawn by European powers reflected their financial interests as much as any strategic consideration. The oil concessions granted in Iraq and Persia followed the same logic as the railway concessions of the 1880s. Resource extraction controlled by foreign capital. The OPDA became a model. After World War I, European powers established similar institutions in other parts of the world. Debt administration boards, financial oversight committees, international loan commissions. The vocabulary changed, but the structure remained the same. Today, the mechanisms are more sophisticated. The institutions have different names, but the principle endures. A nation that borrows from abroad in desperation may find that it has traded its future for a temporary reprieve, and the terms of that trade are rarely favorable. The Dolmabahce Palace still stands in Istanbul. Tourists walk through its halls and admire the chandeliers, but those chandeliers were paid for with money that destroyed an empire. They are a monument to the trap that was set in 1854 and to the lesson that history keeps trying to teach, that the hand offering help may also be holding the contract, and the signature at the bottom of that contract may be the beginning of the end.